So speaking, the very first part of the test you have to go through, aka the reason why you want to give up the rest of the test and your life. Speaking is probably the widest swing when students switch over from IELTS, because it can really go both ways. Either students do much better than they would with IELTS, or they do much worse. Let's have a lengthy discussion about why that is, because I really have to push for getting at least 10 minutes out of this video. Let's talk about how speaking questions are scored. We've been making fun of answer show question for a while now, and by we, I mean me. Its scoring mechanic is completely different from other speaking questions. It is the only one that simply checks whether your answer is correct or not without a qualitative rubric. Basically, if the machine can recognize the word you say and it happens to be correct, you will get the point. It's not so straightforward how scoring works for the other speaking questions, and it's going to take a while to understand how they function. At the first glance, all other speaking questions have the same scoring components: content, pronunciation, and oral fluency. These components have about the same weighting, but they are treated very differently. Let's start with content. This is the bit that's different for each question type, and to a large extent, each individual question. Without diving too deep into that, the content is typically treated as the least worthwhile component to practice and improve. There are two main reasons. The first is precisely because it depends on what questions you get. To put it simply, from a business standpoint, it's not very efficient to teach. The sheer quantity of questions there are means a teacher has to go through a lot of questions to truly prepare a student to score high on content, and that's going to take a long time. Asking students to pay for a course that lasts for 20 hours is already a stretch. Just imagine how many of you would accept something that's twice as long.
You're too funny!
This is usually not feasible since students might want results fast, and many test takers didn't go through a curriculum for secondary education that was taught in English. This means that no matter what or how much academic knowledge they possess, they still have to relearn the whole thing in English to understand everything and guarantee a high score on content. This is just an extra layer of difficulty that can be very hard to overcome. The second reason is even more profound than the first one, and it also happens to be why we can kind of ignore content as a whole. If a student can score high on pronunciation and oral fluency, they typically don't need a high content to get a 79 in speaking, let alone if they are going after a lower score. This mentality has been shown to be effective countless times, that a student would partially tank the content and mainly focus on improving the delivery. The room for error for speaking is so big that a student can indeed afford to do this, and this plays right into the hands of agencies, as they are certainly delighted for a low-stake method that gives good enough results. There is one thing to look out for though. I said partially tank the content, not completely, and it's important for you to not give up on content entirely. If you were to, say, recite a fixed passage repeatedly for every single speaking question, and you do it perfectly because you have been practicing that passage for a month, what score would you get? The answer is 0.
I know!
It would be ridiculous if it could work, wouldn't it? If you can completely avoid answering the question and still get 2/3 of the full score, I'd have some serious doubts about this test's legitimacy. So why a 0? The reason is simple. Content is scored first and is the prerequisite for the other scoring components. If for whatever reason you get a 0 for content, your pronunciation and oral fluency will automatically be given a 0 as well, no matter how perfect your speech actually is. It sounds like a good fail-safe, but in actuality, it doesn't do its job quite right. This is because it is very easy for you to not get a 0 on content. So the strategy just changes from score high on fluency and pronunciation to score high on fluency and pronunciation, and at the same time use some of the words you see in the picture or hear in the passage to get something for content.
The best!
Oh, by the way, the scoring for writing questions are the same. But again, how off topic do you have to be to get a 0 for content? In this course, however, I will not shy away from talking about how to score high on content, and I think this is a big part that many agencies don't cover. After all, it is still worth 1/3 of the points, and there are students who might struggle with fluency and pronunciation, in which case getting a high content will certainly help a lot. And in many cases, it's easier than it seems, so why the hell not?
I know!
Now to the other parts. Pronunciation and oral fluency often go hand in hand when being discussed, so let's take a closer look. For all questions that have these two scoring components, The raw scores for each always go from 0 to 5. If you score a 0, it basically means the machine doesn't recognize your speech at all, or you might be speaking a different language. The main takeaway for how to score high on fluency and pronunciation is very straightforward to summarize. You sound native-like, you get a good score. Of course, the scoring is a bit more nuanced than just being native-like, but a good rule of thumb is to talk like a native speaker, preferably with an American or British accent or something similar. You might be able to get away with it if you insist on going with Scottish or Irish, but I can't give you a definitive answer. People I know with those accents probably don't need to take the test, but going with American or British definitely works. After all, they are the most ubiquitous accents, at least in terms of recognition. It doesn't mean your accent has to be quote-unquote perfect to get a perfect score. My accent is close to being American, but not entirely. There are certain enunciations I do slightly differently than how a typical American would, but it doesn't matter, so you don't have to do this.
The problem is, I fear I have forgotten how I used to talk.
Now, let's see exactly how these items are scored. Let's start with pronunciation. For a perfect score of 5, you would need to address the following. All vowels and consonants are produced in a manner that is easily understood by regular speakers of the language. The speaker uses assimilation and deletions appropriate to continuous speech. Stress is placed correctly in all words and sentence level stress is fully appropriate. Getting a 4 basically means doing slightly worse than a 5, and so on and so forth all the way to a 0, and this is also the case for fluency. We'll talk about the keywords right now. The first two are very straightforward, vowels and consonants. You gotta get those right, like no shit. But the more interesting part is the following, easily understood by regular speakers of the language. This goes back to the accent thing. You don't really need to have a specific accent to pass the test. The more important thing you have to work on is to differentiate how the vowels and consonants are enunciated and, in a way, make sure that the machine understands you. This is quite complicated stuff, so again, follow the rule of thumb. Talk how American or British speakers talk and you'll very likely be fine. Of the two, vowels are by far the more important. I've taught many students who struggle with pronunciation, and it usually traces back to their native dialects. Some students mix up L and N, some struggle with V and W, many can pronounce TH, but the students who struggle the most with pronunciation on their report card, and thus speaking in general, are the ones who can't distinguish vowels. I do have a speculation as to why this is, more on this later. The second part is the stress, which is also a very fundamental part of verbal English. Placing stresses on individual words is a technical thing that can be practiced, but there's more to that. They also mentioned in the scoring that the sentence level stress is also to be examined. I'll be honest with you, this is something that doesn't seem to matter too much. Short answer is, if you're not talking with a monotone like this, you'll probably be fine for this part. This is something that even students who score 90 can mess up a bit. If you have spoken English before, then chances are you will have a pretty decent feel of how it should be, and don't worry if you don't because it's really not that important, and you probably have like 50 other urgent issues with pronunciation that can be fixed first.
You're too funny.
The next two keywords are very interesting, assimilations and deletions. There are specific changes to how things are supposed to sound when words are placed together in a continuous speech, and sometimes they can even come into play in a single word. Assimilations occur when two different sounds become similar simply because they are placed beside one another. Deletions work under similar principles, except it's when one sound gets partially or completely silenced. The keyword continuous speech also implies that there are other factors that might come into play, so long as they serve the purpose of making speech fluent and natural. There will be another video dedicated to this topic, but again, short answer is, if you have been speaking English, you will be subliminally doing this without you knowing it. This is also something students can get by without fully understanding or even being good. So that covers pronunciation. Now let's look at fluency. In order to get a 5, you have to do the following. Speech shows smooth rhythm and phrasing. There are no hesitations, repetitions, false starts, or non-native phonological simplifications. And once again, let's go through the keywords one by one. The first two are rhythm and phrasing. To keep it simple, Rhythm is a natural and slight change of pace, and phrasing designates where the pauses should be. This may come as a surprise to many of you, but this is actually highly related to grammar. Having a good understanding for sentence structure can be very helpful to scoring high on fluency because knowing how the structure works will tell you where pauses are allowed and, probably more importantly, where they aren't allowed. Now let's do a quick fire round for the other keywords, shall we? No hesitations. Don't do this.
What's the word?
No repetitions. Don't do this.
It goes on and on and on and on and on and on.
No false starts. Don't do this.
Just shoot. No, go ahead, shoot it.
What? Okay.
No, not yet.
No non-native phonological simplifications. Damn it. Gotta slow down for this one. Almost made it to the end. Let's break it down a bit. Non-native means you're bad at speaking English, and we already know that.
Okay, enough! You try speaking in another language.
Simplification means you leave stuff out that should be there in the text, which can be a million different things. Phonological, or how the sounds are being produced, is probably the most perplexing part. The way I like to explain to my students is that there are certain habits that cause students to drop sounds, syllables, or even entire words when making a speech. This is also vague as hell, and I won't even try to pretend that I fully understand what this means. To me, it probably means omitting the s's and eds at the end of the words, or something similar elsewhere in the text. By now, you should be rightfully confused. Fluency and pronunciation seem to get in each other's ways and are somehow interconnected. And you'll be right, the scoring can be very annoying to interpret, especially since I don't work for Pearson and I'm not a linguist. This becomes even more of a nuisance when you mix content back into all this. Remember at the beginning I mentioned how some students can score very low? In fact, by then I meant getting a 10 for fluency and pronunciation, which is the lowest score you can get on any category. Usually, two distinct groups can fall victim to this. The first group are girls with squeaky and soft voices.
What?
This has happened too many times to be treated as isolated incidents. The most plausible explanation I can come up with is that their enunciations are not recognized by the grading algorithm. Knowing them in person gives me confidence to say that, because none of them deserved getting a 10. The only advice I can give if you think you might fall into this category is to try to speak with a lower octave. Increase your volume so long as the mic doesn't burst. Not like that. And then I can only wish you good luck. The second group are students from northeastern China, or the ones that have similar enunciations. Their problem is similar. As a teacher, I can understand their speech just fine, but getting 10s on fluency and pronunciation means that the machine doesn't.
Stop my suffering!
The only noteworthy characteristic of their enunciation is how they say their vowels, and how they tend to add in a vowel when a syllable ends with a consonant. These are the exact traits of enunciation for Mandarin Chinese, so in a way they speak Mandarin too well, and the habits screw them up when carried over to speaking English. That's also why I mentioned earlier that vowels are probably more important to get right than consonants. Getting some consonants wrong probably won't cause your entire answer to be unrecognizable, but mispronouncing vowels might. Every syllable must have a vowel, so getting them wrong typically means the mistakes will appear quite frequently. And worse yet, if they are confused with some other vowel, your speech can be recognized as something else entirely, and that can be a costly mistake. Now, the speculation I talked about. I think it is easier for the machine to falsely recognize your speech if your vowels are ambiguous, and thus you lose more points on content, which reaches 0 sometimes and causes a 0 in fluency and pronunciation. This is more of a hunch that has been confirmed with some students, but there's no evidence that supports this claim. Either way, the simplest fix to this potential problem is to get your sounds right, and then you don't have to worry about any of that. So basically, just be good. So to recap, if you mess up your pronunciation, there is a possibility that the machine mistakes your speech for something else or just doesn't recognize it whatsoever, so you lose points in content and then get a 0 in everything as a result. If you mispronounce parts of a word, you might lose points on pronunciation or on fluency for omitting a sound. The rhythm affects oral fluency, but the resulting placement of stress is scored in pronunciation. Grammar is not scored in speaking, but it affects your fluency because it affects the structure of your sentences. Thankfully, you don't need to understand most of this. Hell, I don't fully understand everything. I'm talking about this simply to help you later understand why certain things are done the way they are. Because of the immense complexity, I generally go with the more well-rounded approach instead of focusing on one specific area, and that has gotten many students quite far. Just be good. After all, no matter how good your fluency and pronunciation scores are, nobody looks at them. Not the universities, immigration officers, nobody.
They are monsters.
So at the end of the day, getting that 79 in speaking is the only goal here, and the ways to achieve this all involve improving the holy trifecta one way or another. There is something I like to add to the list of keywords, and that's intonation. It is mentioned in one of the official documents, so it's probably important. Except it's not. Well, not really. Just like many of the tested traits mentioned before, this is also something that comes naturally with speaking English. Intonation is basically having a tone, which is a very prevalent concept in most Asian languages. This is something that is very hard to describe in words but much easier to demonstrate. So what I recommend for practice is follow along when the native speaker is talking and see if you can predict when and where the tone will change from a flat one. The most important application will be at the end of sentences, and since most sentences you will speak for PTE are statements, you generally would end the sentence with the following tone. For most of you, this is enough to score high on speaking, so there won't be much more discussion about this topic. There are other important concepts for speaking that should be discussed. Before you start answering any actual questions, you will have a chance to test the microphone.
Just call me angel of the morning, angel.
This is perfect for checking the clarity of your speech, if the volume needs to be adjusted, and if the equipment is faulty.
Touch my cheeks before you leave me, baby.
Afterwards, you will be asked to make a short speech, like the self-introduction in IELTS. This is something you can prepare for, and it is worth doing so because when you send your score to whatever institute, that voice recording will be sent over as well. Technically, they don't do anything, and all decisions are made according to the score you get, but nevertheless, treat this as an opportunity to warm up for the next 3 hours of mental torture.
Stop my suffering, Diablo.
The speaking part has another annoying mechanic that you should look out for. Whenever you hear a notification in the headset, it means your answering time has begun, and your mic will begin picking up your speech. If at any time during the recording you have a pause for 3 seconds or more, the machine automatically assumes that you're done with the question and then skips to the next one. Usually students don't find this to be a problem, and in most cases you shouldn't be silent for more than 3 seconds anyways.
It goes on and on and on and on and on and on.
That pretty much sums up for the speaking part in general.
The best.
And in the next video, we will start talking about the first question type of the test, read aloud. Please like, subscribe, and share if you find this helpful, and leave in the comments below any question you might have about PTE Academic. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you all next time.
You're too funny.